She is 112 years old. She has outlasted every empire that tried to stop her. The German one, the Japanese one. She has outlasted almost everyone who ever served on her. She has outlasted the 2 world wars that made her famous. And she has outlasted the whole era when battleships meant anything in this world at all. And right now, in a dry dock in Galveston, Texas, she is being brought back to life. And most people have no idea she was ever close to gone. This is the Battleship Texas. And the fact that she still exists at all is the part of her story fewest people know. A whole enemy fleet surrendered in front of her. Off the coast of Normandy, she deliberately let water into her own hull to get a better angle on the enemy. She came through 2 world wars, and then nearly sank in peacetime from plain neglect. She is the last surviving American battleship that served in both wars. The only one still here to prove it. By the end of this video, you will know the whole story of Texas, where she went, what she did, and exactly where she is right now. Before we start, I am genuinely curious where in the world you are watching this from, and if any of you have a connection to Texas, a relative who served on her, or you climbed her deck yourself at some point, anything at all, tell us in the comments. On this channel, we tell these stories for exactly one reason, so that those names get said out loud. Let us go back to where it all started. Her keel was laid in April of 1911 at the shipyard in Newport News, Virginia. She was launched a year later, in May of 12, and by the custom of the day, she was christened by a young woman named Claudia Lyon, breaking a bottle across her bow. Texas was commissioned in March of 1914, 4 months before the First World War began. At the time, she was the most powerful battleship the United States had ever built, one of the first American battleships armed with 14-inch guns. She was built to be the future of naval warfare, and she started proving it almost immediately. Already in July of 1916, she had 3-inch anti-aircraft guns mounted on her, making her the first American battleship able to fire on aircraft at all. And on the 9th of March 1919, after the war, at anchor in Guantanamo Bay, Texas wrote herself into history a second time. From a wooden platform hastily built on top of Turret 2, a pilot named Edward McDonnell flew a Sopwith Camel into the air. For the first time in history, an airplane had launched from an American battleship. A 2-turret Dreadnought, built for gun duels, had just shown what the next century of naval warfare would look like. She had barely finished her sea trials when Europe fell into war. America stayed out of it for 3 years. Texas spent those years drilling in the Atlantic, training crews, and waiting. When the United States finally entered the war in 17, she crossed the ocean and joined Britain's Grand Fleet in the North Sea, the largest concentration of naval firepower the world had ever assembled, standing directly across the path of the German High Seas Fleet. Here is what most people do not understand about what that was actually like. Both the Grand Fleet and the German fleet were too valuable to risk in a decisive battle, and both sides knew it. One catastrophic loss could hand control of the sea to the other side and change the whole war. So they circled each other. Convoy escorts, winter patrols in the North Sea, fog and cold, and the constant knowledge that the enemy fleet was out there, simply not coming out. More than once that summer, Texas and her squadron escorted American mine layers, laying part of the huge North Sea mine barrage, a belt of mines stretching from Norway to the Orkney Islands, meant to seal German submarines inside their own harbors. Texas spent months in this suspended state, powerful enough to end the naval war in a single afternoon, and never given the chance to. Then, on the 21st of November, 1918, everything changed. At 3:35 in the morning, Texas got underway to meet the surrendering German fleet. 74 German ships, battleships, battlecruisers, destroyers, steaming in a single column. The war was over, and Texas was there to see it end. The Grand Fleet formed 2 lines on either side of the German column and escorted it in, guns loaded, and trained on both sides in case of a trap that never came. Nobody fired a shot. There was nothing left to fire at. The men on Texas's deck stood at the rails and watched in silence as the column passed by. gray on gray water. Ships that yesterday had been a mortal threat and today were reduced to a powerless procession. The most powerful navy Germany had ever built was surrendering itself, and Texas was there for every mile of it. She was home by Christmas. Now here is the part almost everyone skips entirely, the 20 years that came after. The Texas that went off to fight the Second World War was not the same ship that came home from the First. In 1925, she went into dry dock and was converted from coal to oil, her old coal boilers cut out and oil boilers put in their place. It was a fundamental shift. It changed how she operated, how quickly she could be refueled at sea, and how far she could go without resupply. And she became the last American battleship to make that conversion. A ship that carried two technological eras of the Navy inside one hull. She was modernized again and again. New fire control systems, heavier anti-aircraft armament. And around the turn of 38 into 39, she received an experimental radar set, one of the first fitted to any American warship, years before radar became standard on every combat vessel. Ships built after her were already being scrapped, and she was still being upgraded. From 27 to 31, Texas was flagship of the entire United States fleet as it existed then. Across 2 decades between the wars, only 4 ships in the whole Navy were ever given that honor, and Texas was one of them. It was from her bridge that the fleet ran its major maneuvers, rehearsing, on paper and at sea, a war nobody was seriously expecting yet. Nobody on her bridge then knew who she would fight or where. That would only become clear more than 10 years later, in a different ocean. And in 1924, she took part in a test that quietly reshaped every American warship that followed her. Together with the battleship New York, she opened fire on and sank the unfinished battleship Washington, a ship canceled under the Naval Treaty before she ever fired a shot, turned instead into a live target for her own Navy. Shell after shell, Texas's guns pounded that twin hull. Engineers logged every hit and every hole torn open, and the results showed that battleship deck armor could not stand up to shells falling steeply from above. That forced changes to the armor and hull design of every ship built after. Texas was not just surviving on her own. Her own shells were helping the Navy learn exactly how to kill a battleship, and that made the next generation of ships harder to sink. Remember that, because it will matter for what kind of ship she turned out to be. When the Second World War began, Texas was 27 years old. By any reasonable measure, a battleship that age should have been retired. On top of that, her crew had grown enormously over the decades. Where 1,042 men had served the day she was commissioned, she now carried up to 1,810 officers and men, nearly double. Instead of retirement, on the 8th of November 1942, she went into her first combat of the new war as part of Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa. She sailed as flagship of Rear Admiral Monroe Kelly and the Northern Attack Group, heading for Media and Port Lyautey. The key to seizing the airfield was an old 500-year-old fortress called the Kasbah guarding the approach. And instead of a frontal assault, the Allies sent the destroyer Dallas straight past it, up the Cebu River, guided through shallows and sunken wrecks by a volunteer Moroccan river pilot named René Maleverne, who later became the first foreign civilian ever awarded the American Navy Cross. While Dallas fought her way upriver under fire toward the airfield, Texas hit Vichy French positions and ammunition depots on shore, firing 272 main battery shells over 2 days. It was one of the first major American combat operations of the entire war against Germany and her allies. Texas was 28 years old and firing at an enemy for the first time in her life. By the 11th of November, French resistance in Morocco had ended, the airfield was in Allied hands, and Texas had her first victory of the new war, 24 years after she had last watched an enemy surrender. But nothing she did in North Africa comes close to what happened next. On the morning of the 6th of June, 1944, Texas took up a firing position roughly 7 miles off Pointe du Hoc on the coast of Normandy. She had been designated the bombardment flagship for the western half of Omaha Beach. On the point, Allied intelligence believed, stood a battery of 6 guns of 155 millimeters, able to reach both Omaha and the neighboring beach at Utah, and the entire invasion fleet besides. It was for those guns the 225 Rangers under Lieutenant Colonel James Rudder were, at that very moment, climbing the 90-foot vertical cliffs of Pointe du Hoc, storming the battery under fire from above. Those men were her responsibility. She was 30 years old, and at 10 minutes to 6 that morning, she opened fire. Over the next 34 minutes, she put 255 14-inch shells into the German positions on the point. As the day wore on and German resistance stiffened, Texas closed in, cutting her range to under 2 miles from shore by afternoon, nearly point blank for a battleship. She stayed on station for days, supporting troops pushing inland, answering call after call for fire on German positions pinning down American infantry. On the 7th of June, word came that the Rangers on Pointe du Hoc were cut off, surrounded, and running out of ammunition. Texas sent 2 landing craft ashore, loaded with ammunition, food, water, and medical supplies. The Rangers sent back 35 wounded men and 27 prisoners. By the end of that day, of the 225 men who had scaled the cliffs that morning, only about 90 were still fit to fight. And when the Rangers finally reached the gun positions at the top, the casemates were empty. Back in April, after an air raid, the Germans had secretly hauled the guns a mile inland, leaving telephone poles in the concrete pits to fool aerial reconnaissance. The real guns were found hours later, hidden in a sunken lane nearby, and destroyed with thermite grenades. The battery that had cost more than 100 men killed and wounded had stood somewhere else the whole time, though neither the Rangers nor Texas could have known that beforehand. Texas kept firing until the beachhead was secure, then withdrew to England to rearm. Now, here is the part that surprises people every time. On the 15th of June, Texas returned to Normandy. By then, the Allies had pushed further inland than her guns could reach at their normal elevation. The angle simply was not enough. The targets had moved beyond her range. So her crew made a decision that had never been made in combat before. They deliberately flooded the torpedo blister on the starboard side, letting water into the hull on purpose so the ship would list. Texas heeled over by just 2 degrees, exactly enough to change the elevation of her guns and reach targets that had moved out of reach. It was an enormous gamble. A battleship that takes on water does not always come back out of it. They did it anyway. This was not the most famous moment of the war. It happened 9 days later, quietly, when nobody was watching, simply because the job was not finished. A few days after that, Texas met something the histories rarely mention. On the 25th of June, she closed on the vital port of Cherbourg, and alongside the battleship Arkansas, opened fire on the fortifications and batteries around the city. And the German coastal guns answered. A German shore battery, the American sailors nicknamed Battery Hamburg, had her in its sights by around 12:30. At 16 minutes past 1, a 240-millimeter shell slammed into her fire control tower. At the wheel in that moment stood Quartermaster 3rd Class Kristen Christensen, 21 years old. He was killed instantly. Nearly everyone else on the navigating bridge was wounded, 1 man dead and 10 wounded in all. Her captain, Charles Baker, escaped unhurt by some miracle and immediately ordered the bridge cleared. The ship no enemy had ever managed to sink had, that day, taken her wound and lost a man. The battery was not finished. At 2:45, a second shell of the same caliber struck her. It punched through the hull and landed inside an officer's stateroom, coming to rest on his bunk. And it did not explode. A German shell capable of tearing a ship's insides apart lay on the mattress as a dead piece of steel. Texas did not leave her station. She finished the job, then made her own way back, carrying both the wound from the German shell and its unexploded twin, which was simply left aboard. It is still kept on the ship in Galveston today, a fragment of that morning that could have killed and did not. In August of '44, Texas supported the Allied landings in southern France, Operation Dragoon, covering troops along the Mediterranean coast. By that point, she had been in nearly continuous combat for almost 2 years and had crossed the Atlantic more than once. She was 30 years old and showed no sign of slowing down. Then she crossed the entire world to the other side of it. Transferred to the Pacific in late '44, she arrived in time for the invasion of Iwo Jima in February of '45. What Texas faced at Iwo Jima was unlike anything she had seen in Europe. The island had been fortified for years. The Japanese had dug a whole network of tunnels and bunkers beneath it that absorbed tremendous punishment and kept fighting. Texas ran nearly 3 straight days of bombardment, pouring shell after shell into positions that barely seemed to notice. When the Marines finally went ashore, Texas stayed close, answering calls for fire from men fighting for every foot of volcanic rock. On the 23rd of February, she was slowly circling offshore at barely 2 knots, Mount Suribachi right off her starboard side. When the ship's chaplain announced over the loudspeaker that a flag was about to go up on the summit, the whole crew, it seemed, ran to that rail. There was no warning. The flag simply shot upward, red, white, and blue, snapping in the wind high above the mountain. The men on Texas's deck watched it with their own eyes, miles from where the most famous photograph of the war would be taken, barely a couple of hours later, at the second flag raising. Then she moved to Okinawa, where she spent 50 days firing on Japanese positions and fighting off wave after wave of kamikaze attacks. For all 50 of those days, her crew barely left their battle stations. Men slept in snatches inside the turrets and cramped compartments deep in the hull, ready to jump to the guns at any second, week after week, without a single quiet day and almost no real sleep. In that time, Texas fired nearly 6,000 rounds of anti-aircraft ammunition. Not one of those kamikazes ever touched her. She shot down 1 plane herself and helped down 3 more, while ships around her burned one after another, and the sea off Okinawa in those weeks became one of the most dangerous places on the planet for any warship afloat. When Japan surrendered in August of '45, Texas was being readied for the invasion of the Japanese home islands. That invasion never came. Instead, she spent the months after the war bringing the survivors home. She picked up prisoners of war from the Philippines and carried them to Hawaii, then ferried nearly 5,000 soldiers and sailors straight to the California coast, part of an operation with a fitting name, Magic Carpet. A battleship built to kill spent the last months of that war carrying people home alive. She had been commissioned before the First World War even began. She was still fighting when the Second one ended. She is the last surviving American battleship that can say that. So, where did she end up? Saving her was never a foregone conclusion. Most battleships that old simply went to the scrappers. What saved her was a campaign that pulled in the whole state. Wicker baskets went up in every classroom, and school children across Texas dropped in coins, nickels, and dimes, each one earning a certificate naming them an honorary member of the Navy. Leading the fundraising was Lloyd Gregory, the first chairman of the Battleship Commission, and 2 future political heavyweights joined the cause. Congressman Lyndon Johnson and Albert Thomas pushed to have the ship preserved as a memorial to the men who had served on her. The coins were enough. In 1948, Texas was decommissioned and handed over to the state of Texas. She became the first American battleship ever preserved as a permanent museum ship, and the first battleship declared a National Historic Landmark. On the 17th of March, '48, she made her final voyage up the Houston Ship Channel to a berth beside the San Jacinto Monument, arriving on the 20th of April. She would never move under her own power again. There is another side to that rescue, one almost never mentioned on her deck. Texas had a sister ship built to the same design, the New York, who had fought the same war, served in the same Grand Fleet, watched the same German surrender in 18. After the Second World War, New York was sent to Bikini Atoll to be put on the line for the same atomic tests that would later kill several Iowa-class battleships. She survived both blasts, came out contaminated, and on the 6th of July, 48, the Navy took her out to sea off Hawaii and sank her as a target. That happened only a few months after her sister Texas was declared a museum. The same design, the same war, the same fate right up to the very end. And then two completely different outcomes, and only one of the two ships survives to this day. Millions of people walked her decks over the following decades. Children pressed their hands against the steel of her gun turrets, never knowing those guns had fired at Normandy. Veterans who had served on her came back to stand on her deck one more time in old age, to find their old bunk or their old station at a gun, and simply stand there in silence. She was a place where the war still existed in physical form, something you could touch, walk into, and feel. And all that time, she was slowly dying. A hull that had survived 2 world wars, the North Atlantic, Normandy, Iwo Jima, and 50 days of kamikaze attacks, was losing a fight to a far less dramatic enemy: rust. The state of Texas lacked the money and the expertise to properly maintain a 27,000-ton warship. Dry docking her, without which the hull could not be inspected or repaired, was expensive and complicated, and it kept getting put off, year after year, budget after budget, because there was always something more urgent to spend the money on. Seawater found its way in, and then more of it did. By 2010, the leaks had grown serious enough that her hull was sitting several feet lower in the water than it should have. By 2017, she was listing 8 degrees to starboard and pumping tens of thousands of gallons out of her hull every single day just to stay afloat. The pumps ran around the clock every day just to keep the museum afloat one more day. And almost nobody who walked her deck that day to photograph her guns had any idea that a real fight for the ship's life was going on beneath their feet. Think about that. The ship that had deliberately flooded herself off Normandy to stay in the fight was now flooding herself by accident. And there was almost no one left to pump her back out. She was closed to visitors. The question was no longer how to restore her. The question was whether she could be saved at all. In 22, the answer came. On the 31st of August, starting at 6 in the morning, the entire Houston ship channel was shut down for one ship. A 110-year-old battleship that could barely stay afloat on her own was walked off her mooring stern first, turned 90 degrees right there in the channel, and towed toward Galveston. By 4 that afternoon, ahead of schedule, she was in place. Thousands of people came out onto the shore and the bridges along the channel just to watch an old battleship pass by. Texas was towed into dry dock at the Gulf Copper facility in Galveston. When the water was finally pumped out and engineers saw her hull whole, from the outside, in daylight, for the first time in decades, what they found was worse than the grimmest predictions. Decades of accumulated decay spread across the entire bottom, corrosion that had eaten through steel that had been in place since before the First World War, in places clean through. What followed was one of the largest warship restoration projects in American history, costing roughly $75 million. What was once meant to take a few months stretched into years of grinding, mostly invisible work below the waterline. More than 700 tons of corroded steel were cut away and replaced. To put that in perspective, 700 tons is roughly 500 cars worth of metal, cut out of her hull and replaced with new plate, sheet by sheet. The restoration took 300,000 hours of labor. Her hull was repainted in her Second World War camouflage. A new pine deck was laid across the entire ship. Systems that had not worked in decades were rebuilt, and for the first time in many decades, Texas's hull stopped leaking. She was floating on her own again, and she was moved more than once within that same shipyard, from one dock to another, as the work pushed deeper into the hull. After all of it, after 2 world wars, more than 70 years as a museum, and years of flooding and neglect, she was afloat again. So, where is she now? She is still at the Gulf Copper Yard in Galveston, where the restoration has entered its final phase. Her permanent home will be Pier 15, between the cruise ship terminals, a 10-minute walk from the historic Strand district. The city locked in that agreement in 25. She is expected to reopen as a full museum around the turn of 26 into 27. Texas was at war before the airplane changed the shape of warfare, and she was the one who first showed that shape was changing, launching a fighter off her own turret in 1919. She watched the entire German fleet surrender in 18 and spent the next 26 years getting ready for the next war. Off Normandy, she flooded herself on purpose to get a better angle, and off Cherbourg, she took a shell that wounded her and a shell that never went off and simply stayed aboard. Over 50 days at Okinawa, she fired nearly 6,000 rounds, and not one kamikaze ever touched her. She crossed 2 oceans, fought on 4 fronts in a single war, and was still fighting when atomic bombs ended it. And of all the dreadnoughts ever launched on either side of the ocean, dozens were sunk in battle, cut up for scrap, or sent to the bottom as targets, her own sister included. Texas is the only one still here today in her original form. She was never the largest or the most powerful battleship ever built. She is simply the last of an entire generation of ships that once ruled the seas and outlived the age that made them. And what very nearly finished her was something no enemy managed to do in 2 wars. Not a torpedo, not a bomb, not a shell. Rust. Quietly taking on water at a river dock while visitors walked past, never knowing what they were looking at. A ship no one could sink in battle almost sank herself, simply because peacetime never found the money for her. She was saved by ordinary people from her own state, who made sure the money for her repair finally came through, the same way their grandparents once collected coins in a classroom basket. The same hull, the same guns, the very ship that watched the German fleet surrender in 18, that stood 7 miles off the coast of Normandy on the most important morning of the 20th century, that carries an unexploded German shell and the name of a dead helmsman, that was still fighting in the Pacific when the war finally ended, 31 years after she was commissioned. She is 112 years old, and there is no other ship like her anywhere in the world. If you have made it this far, tell us in the comments where you're watching from and the name of the one you remember. She will be standing in Galveston. Go see her while you still can.